Hi, everyone, and welcome to another Evidence-Based Social Work Alliance podcast. I'm joined today by George Fielding and Miriam. My name is Robin Carling. I'm a children's social worker. And get George, you are our guest today. So let's hear your introduction.
Hi, everybody. Great to be on this podcast. I'm here today in a personal capacity, but I have many different hats in that make this a fundamentally important and interesting conversation for me. One, I was the youngest person to ever be a registered director of a care quality commission social care provider. I've set up two social care providers that remain operational, delivering domiciliary and residential care across England. However, I no longer uh, have a executive role in those organisations, and but my interest in and understanding of the importance of social work and social care comes from the fact that I was born with cerebral palsy. I'm a manual wheelchair user and therefore a recipient of the services on a daily basis. Um, and so, yeah, which is why all of these things are important to me.
Thank you. And Miriam, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, hello, I'm Miriam. I'm a social worker for children with disabilities. I'm also speaking in a personal capacity. Um, and so my interest in this podcast is informed by my profession, my involvement with the Evidence-Based Social Work Alliance, and I'm also type 1 diabetic, so have close personal kind of links to healthcare services and the vulnerability that comes from living with a chronic ill health condition.
Thank you. And George, I think that the Evidence-Based Social Work Alliance, our focus has primarily been about concerns around gender identity,
Mm.
whereas your campaigning background is mostly around disabilities. But I think you've had some concerns about the
Mm.
overlap between these two issues. And I was just wondering if you could share those concerns, give us a bit more insight into where they come from.
Okay. I would firstly say that the majority of people that I've supported and in social care, but also in a day-to-day basis on a day-to-day basis with what I do professionally now is in youth work, and therefore what I fundamentally believe is that we are not good as a society about about um, about training, supporting young people with disabilities through what is a natural biological process, puberty. I genuinely believe that it is natural for every human being to have questions about how their body is changing and what happens during that period of your life. And within the disability arena, what we are seeing at this moment in time is the conflation of a statistic which I have questions about. Um, Scope and other organisations have recently said that kind of 1 in 3 people with disabilities identify as LGBTQ, and I don't know of a reason why uh, people with disabilities would be any more likely to identify as or to have a same sex attracted as any other member of the community. And if they were, that would of course not be a problem and should be celebrated and supported. And so what I'm seeing and what I'm aware of personally is that there is a vulnerability given the fact that society hasn't facilitated these conversations or has no awareness of these conversations, of how to deal with the complexity of these conversations. There is a vulnerability in the community uh, to fashionable trends, to messages that you know, and and what we see now is a lot of people, perhaps with good intent, believing or identifying as trans when they see that they haven't been supported to articulate who kind of actually kind of what they are. I've got questions around that, but I've also, from an operational perspective, got questions around whether patients, whether clients, whether service users have the ability to question, to kind of articulate, or to know kind of whether they are always safe in their home and in a private environment, in an intimate environment with a carer. I don't believe that there are appropriate mechanisms or ways in which you would be able to tell uh, kind of always that somebody would, or whether harm had been done in somebody's home or in a care home as a result of them not having a right to same-sex care always. And therefore, and there's many reasons as to why as to why that would be the case, which we'll go on to, but that and all of this, if I may say so, either the conversation about same-sex attraction and how young people identify with disabilities identify, or the reporting at this moment in time falls back upon the person receiving the care or their unpaid carer. This is a long-held problem we've got, is that the burden of reporting and communication and all of the stress, all of the record keeping, all of these things kind of lie outside of statutory bodies, but with the voluntary workforce, the people, the families, and the carers who are going, as ever, unsupported and unpaid.
Okay, so we've got two strains to go down there. We've got the concerns about the seeming overrepresentation of gender identity issues in people with disabilities, and then we've got the care and safeguarding aspect. Just in case, to avoid any confusion coming forward, we have been joined by Sarah Philimore while George was speaking there. So if you hear an unfamiliar voice, that'll be who's jumping in. Miriam, I'll follow up the first strain of George's point and sort of come to you. Have you seen in your work this growing overrepresentation or seeming overrepresentation of gender identity in vulnerable young people with disabilities, and what sort of trends have you seen within that?
I have to be honest that in my personal caseload, it's not something that I have seen, but it's something that I've read about in the sort of emerging evidence about children who are presenting with gender distress or becoming diagnosed with gender dysphoria, that it's often coming alongside diagnoses of autism. And I think there are a couple of dynamics that need further understanding, which I suppose is sort of one of the goals of the Evidence-Based Social Work Alliance, is actually that in order to do our jobs properly, we do need sort of robust evidence that sits sort of separately from political discussion and enables social workers to remain clear-headed about what they're seeing and develop clear understandings of how to work with the young people who present with these needs and with these kind of comorbidities. I think there's also another element to this, which is about how does the language of gender identity enable self-exploration for a cohort of people who perhaps find concepts of self, theory of mind, understanding other people difficult to articulate. What is it about the language of LGBT that offers something, and what does it offer? What is gained through using this language to self-describe? And then what happens next if the use of that language leads to a certain kind of intervention that may or may not be reaching the core of the issue. But I actually think we don't have enough of an understanding at the moment to say what the core of the issue is, or might be in any individual. But those are the sort of two things that my brain goes to.
And Miriam, if I may say so, to add on to that, I think what we see is everybody wants a community, wants connection, needs love, relationships, all of all all of these things. And what you I think see as a kind of narrative that has kind of that I think has got a lot from the disability rights community in terms of nothing about us without us, in terms of um, the fact that I have a right over my body and my own decision making, and the Mental Capacity Act, for instance, says that we all have a right to make unwise decisions, and that we must assume capacity at all costs. Indeed, it is only an independent mental capacity assessor that can determine whether somebody doesn't have capacity or not, and that's exactly as it should be. Because we should, but there, there is a complexity here that everything the disability rights movement stands for is independent living, independent voice, independent mind, and also the enablement of free expression, and in law under the Mental Capacity Act, that is that's grounded in that, and therefore kind of all of those trends from the disability rights movement, which I have never before questioned in my life, what you see is that, in my opinion, is that coming up against a kind of shallow narrative online, often by influencers, etc., of be kind, of affirmation of people's disabilities in the way that's and the ways that they want to and the ways that they want to identify, and maybe those trends have been too successful because the complexity we have now is what right under law and what right in social care, what right in the NHS do doctors, social workers, all of these people have to say, it is not safe for you to have this intervention, or to question the motivation behind why somebody is wanting to identify in a certain way. And I worry, much like the assisted dying bill and other things that are going through Parliament at the moment, the reason that they are perhaps more likely to self-identify with gender dysphoria or as trans is because of unprocessed hurt or trauma, and so therefore in those circumstances what it is a claiming of, this is my identity, I want you to respect kind of my lived experience, kind of, and affirm who I want to be and see myself as. And they've got a community they've got around them telling them that that is the right approach to take. And and now we're in a position where anybody who may believe that that isn't the right approach to take doesn't have as much space or platform or resource as they should do to make that case.
So when we look at sort of the data on what is happening with young people who are questioning their gender identity at the moment, both in the UK and across the Western world, that's one of the big sort of co-occurring conditions that is highlighted over and over again would be neurodevelopmental concerns, autism and ADHD in particular. And I'm wondering, George, if within the disabled community, a term I use loosely because every time we use the word community, it's often far more heterogeneous than that word implies.
Mm.
But do you see that trend in particular? Are there specific um groups within that community who seem to be embracing the gender identity more or less compared to one
Mm.
another, or is it fairly even
Mm.
across the board? What's your experience been?
Um, in response to your question, Robin, I'm not Ludwig Wittgenstein. I'm not a linguist, and nor am I a lawyer. Uh, but I'm still going to answer that question as best I can, or at least pose some questions for other people to answer. I think we've got ourselves into a right mess because I'm not sure even people that spend their days talking about disability like I do know how to define it. I think that it is so countercultural of anybody with a lived experience of a disability to not include or to, I think for a lot of reasons, uh, people with disabilities are all alive to the likelihood of structural, social, and other discriminations. We live in an ableist society, and therefore it is so countercultural and uncomfortable to not invite people into conversations around how we could make a more accessible, inclusive society. Within neurodiversity, I supported people with complex needs and autism there, and I do not need to be reminded, and we shouldn't need to be reminded that there are people with autism that find being in a room with lights and sounds and all of these things very very difficult. There's a lot of people in with autism who are non-verbal, um, uh, and therefore I, to those individuals, it would be incredibly wrong of me to not say that they are disabled. And indeed, individuals with autism are often the least likely to be employed. I think only 12% of people with autism are in full-time employment. Do think I'm seeing kind of also included within the neurodiversity bracket is ADHD, anxiety. There has been so much of an increase in anxiety, especially amongst young people after COVID, because of the unexpected lockdowns that we all hated and went through. And I, I simply worry, if I may say so, that we are treating anxiety, although it is horrible when you're experiencing it, as a uh, long term disability, when it is actually, if there was the right resourcing in places, a short-term psychological need, and our inability to understand and resource it as a short-term psychological need has meant that uh, has meant that anxiety, which people with neurodiversity and disability are more prone to, is being treated and understood to be a disability in and of itself. I've got concerns and questions as to whether that is truly sustainable in the long term.
I can just come in on that point. I I agree that there are sort of various axes of need and vulnerability that differently disabled people might show. And I think that what you've landed on, George, is that some uh, impairments might be static across a lifetime and some might be volatile. And I think that when it comes to what are we as a society trying to achieve for people with disability? You earlier talked about kind of participation, workplace, independent living skills, self-determination, all of these kind of, let's loosely call them aims, but they are also reflected in many laws that seek to benefit disabled people. They all do work towards this idea that whether the need is static or dynamic or volatile, that the resources should be put in place to magnify those opportunities for disabled people. And I think that some of what you're describing in terms of anxiety or perhaps kind of point at which the definition of disability becomes harder or grayer in terms of the level of need or the level of impairment. So in my role, for example, we put in care packages that are assessed against certain criteria that are not based on what somebody's diagnosed with on paper, but are based on sort of specific care needs. So there are lots and lots of disabled children we work with who do not meet the criteria of these and therefore would not receive a care package, but might still have support needs of one kind or another. And so if, as you describe, the right resources are put in to meet the right need, then some of those things that, like anxiety, could be acute rather than chronic, are instead being pathologized into something that perhaps qualifies people for a kind of support that they would like or that they benefit from across a lifetime, rather than an expectation of independence. And so I think it's tricky because across the board, resources for people in society are less, and therefore, in a way, seeking to understand your need as a form of disability is a way of receiving resources that are earmarked in a very, very resource poor society at the moment. So that's one way. And I think that it sort of changes the conversation away from lots of people have support needs and lots of people need additional resources to achieve independence and opportunity. And there may have been times in the past where those resources were not necessarily coming out of the same pot as disability that is perhaps more self-explanatory.
Yes. And if I may say so, just tagging on that and strengthening what you're saying, gaining a diagnosis, the waiting lists for for doctor's appointments, for specialist support across the piece are incredibly difficult, and therefore I don't want to quote Kafka, but Kafka said sometimes the punishment is the process. Okay, and therefore, I do have to say that if you've gone through the process, the painful, bureaucratic, complex process of getting a diagnosis, you feel like you've earned something. It's tiring, it's emotional, you've been questioned left, right, and center. Of course, you feel like it's a badge. You feel like it's something that you should wear with pride and that you should tell people about. And so there is a sense of rebirth. Now I've got the diagnosis that I always should have had. I'm going to celebrate this, and you deserve to give me those accommodations and those rights, because actually it's your fault as a system and a society that you haven't recognized me as my true self a long time ago. And 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 that actually has very historical connotations or implications for the disabled community, because on the one hand, as a disabled person, you're either an angel, so you would never smoke, never drink, never have sex, never do anything criminal because you're an angel, or you're a devil. You are paying the price for a sin you made in your previous life. both of which both connotations are absolute nonsense. But you know, but all of the same, there is a narrative that for a long time people with disabilities have been treated as other, as less worthy of being sinful, and as having to kind of prove themselves medically and socially, and I think that is having unhelpful connotations, because now people not given the support to actually psychologically process the hurt that they have, or indeed, I want to say to everybody that struggled to get a diagnosis that, one, I'm sorry, but two, you know, I don't think in the vast majority of cases when you've acquired a certificate or when you've acquired that diagnosis, your biology has changed very much. And if at all, um, and um, and now that you have a certificate and a diagnosis, you also need to be supported clinically and otherwise to process how your life might be different and what it is reasonable for you to expect society to give you as a response to that diagnosis, to go around kind of using your new identity or disability as a badge and expecting you to be given every accommodation that you ask for isn't necessarily something that is sustainable or realistic, because how we resource disability, how we talk about disability, how we talk about anything to do with EDI is complex, and there are going to be competing narratives around this that we all need to grapple with, but especially those that are new to this space and are processing some form of trauma or hurt as a result of an elongated diagnosis.
So to what extent, linking that back to gender, for example, would you say that there's an element of transformation whereby there's an opportunity for an abstract self to take the forefront in tension with the realities of the body? Because that's one of the things that I find quite interesting in that area, is the way in which we're talking about sort of neurodevelopmental differences in a overlap with kind of burden of proof and how that might appear to others, how that has a social interface. And then likewise with gender distress or gender identity, it's something that isn't necessarily physically manifestable. And so the body is held in tension with kind of conscious notion of the self. And I think it ties in with what you were saying about processing hurt. I think that part of the human experience in general is sort of, well, lots of societies have lots of different manifestations of the difficulty of integrating the mind and the body, and to what extent do we understand ourselves as one thing, one integrated self, or not. Which again, you've invoked philosophy a number of times already, and we start moving into quite philosophical territory in terms of, where does the mind start, the body begin, and we're not going to solve those problems in this podcast. But I think the sort of assertion of the self in, as you say, in dialogues and narratives that talk about self-determination, that talk about kind of the ability to advocate for oneself in a kind of resource competitive environment, or in an environment that has othered disabled people against their will, that perhaps there's something about self-othering that seeks to rectify that.
Yes. Let me try and address this as simply as I can. I'm not saying this, but is in, I think it's a legitimate question to ask, is somebody's gender identity the easiest or one of the easier things that they can claim for themselves? Because in the current context of Be Kind, No Debate, and a kind of liberalization, if that's the right word, of sexual orientation, it is especially amongst younger people and actually organizations who seek to do compassionate work. So the third sector, the youth sector, social work, it is the instinct to affirm and give acceptance to that thing that they are claiming and wanting. And it is, whoever we are, we all want more control over our lives. And we all want to be listened to. We all want to be supported in our decision making. And therefore, we are going to make the decisions for ourselves, and we are going to claim the spaces and the places and the communities that are in which it is easiest for us to do that. And therefore, if it is wrong for people and harmful for people with disabilities to identify as a gender that's other than their biological sex, then I legitimately ask people, why is it that they are finding it so hard to have their needs and their opinions met in other spaces and places within statutory services, within schools, etc., etc. And yes, I do think in this current moment in time, some may say that your gender identity is one of the easiest things to claim and fight uh, and and be affirmed. And somehow, and I say this as a bisexual man myself, it has become contestably easier to say that you're trans rather than you are not necessarily heterosexual. And therefore, the stigma and where the stigma's placed has perhaps, and the dial for that stigma has perhaps moved with the times and the trends.
Well, I think this idea of rebirth that you were mentioning earlier is very interesting when you were drawing the comparison between gender identity and diagnosis. Because when I work with a lot of families, particularly where the children may be experiencing behavioral problems, there's often a feeling that there may be a undiagnosed issue there, perhaps something neurodevelopmental. Parents are always often advocating for that to be explored. And one of the conversations I find myself having over and over again is what would change, what would be different tomorrow were you to get the diagnosis today. And often I find that the answer that people have to that is, well, actually, not a lot would change, but it would mean that I'm heard or that I would have access to these resources. And I think that gender identity sort of provides the same opportunity of relief, the psychological opportunity of relief. We know there's a lot of literature about how societies at a given time have different ways that are acceptable of expressing your discontent or your upset. And what we're seeing is in both in the sort of scramble for more diagnoses and in the increase in gender identity is people expressing that they're feeling disempowered, whether they're feeling disempowered by their context, whether they're feeling disempowered by something social, whether they're feeling disempowered by their own suffering and their own psychological state at that point in time. And rather than saying, okay, let's do everything we can to get you a diagnosis. And I'm not saying that's not the right answer in some situations, but rather than saying, let's do everything we can to get you a diagnosis, or let's do everything we can to affirm your gender identity, what is underlying that, and can we address what's leading to you feeling so disempowered and what's leading to this state of suffering? I can
Yes.
see you're wanting to come back on that, Miriam.
Well, I think you've put it really well, Robin, but I also wanted to kind of like combine that with something that George said before you picked up on his train of thought. But it links really well together, because I think right back at the beginning, George raised the matter of the safeguarding aspect of the same services, the social care services that deliver resources and deliver recognition and can kind of give that outlet for discontent. But to sort of turn it on its head, one of the questions that is asked quite a lot in social care, or is a kind of measure, I suppose, sort of abstract measure to try and make the work relevant and tangible, is, what would happen if I left this situation? Is it safe for me to leave the situation? Is this person safe without me here? What would happen if I didn't provide this resource? So you do have to do a certain degree of mental exercise. It's not just about putting the resources in, it's also about not putting the resources in, because the resources are finite. But that is, again, it can be broadened in terms of what would happen for disabled people, full stop, at an individual underpopulation level if those resources disappeared. And then, would that be safe? How would we know whether it was safe? Who is responsible for that safety, and who does that lack of safety or that vulnerability fall back on? What are the ramifications? And I think that one of the ramifications that I think, George, you were sort of indicating is that when it comes to how do people assert themselves, there are lots of people with disabilities who are so vulnerable that they're not necessarily able to assert themselves at all, to the point of not being able to express unsafety or danger or abuse. Meanwhile, people who are more able to assert themselves might be able to, as well as we're seeing at the moment, assert that there is no right to same-sex care, for example, or that it's not a sort of good measure of safety, that it's not a good measure of whether somebody is more likely to be safeguarded, and that if the people around a disabled person want to assert themselves through the lens of gender identity, that should be facilitated regardless of the sex of the carer that's preferred, specified, or safer for the disabled person. So I think that you were hinting at that earlier, and I just wanted to kind of come back to it, because we've talked a lot around that but not addressed it. So that was my like piggyback over to that. I hope it made sense.
Yes, it does. As I said, everything around this is complex, okay? But let me try and say this as clearly as I can. For 18 months, as a young man in secondary school, I wasn't allowed to attend my PE lessons. The reason that I wasn't allowed to attend my PE lessons was because they didn't have a teaching assistant of the same sex as me who could help me unbutton my shirt and change into a gym kit. So in quite a lot of, at least when I was growing up, it was the safest thing to do to predicate or to prioritize same-sex care. Or same-sex support. Not always easy to resource, because men don't often do care, or vice versa. There's such a supply. There's such a need for people in support roles. But what that means is that there are a lot of young people with disabilities where their first experience of being undressed or being, so we say, supported intimately is with somebody of the same sex. So you become perhaps more comfortable around somebody of the same sex in that environment. That comfortableness is perhaps arguably only a kind of shallow form of attraction. And therefore what the thing that I was never facilitated to do, or that I think the schools and youth clubs and support services that I have been a part of always struggle to do, is to facilitate a healthy conversation, a kind of around attractions and orientation. So there is the closest often that we allow people to get to that conversation is when that they are supported intimately in a caring capacity, and that that has that has implications, because I think that we in sectors and systems, especially in support work and social care, have got used to the fact that actually our work is intimate and these people need intimate care, but we've not gone so far as to say that they may need support and specialist support to live and enjoy healthy sex and relationships education. And so, if I am right with those trends, what you are seeing is perhaps a lot of young people that come into adolescence who only really know how to say, maybe I am different because I'm only ever allowed that kind of intimate care. And what that means is that perhaps when a new community or identity come along, all they really know is that they are different, or they feel different to their peers, and want to be accepted. And yeah, that flip that on its head for a second around adults and other things. You are now in social care being denied the right to same-sex care, and there are many cases kind of where this is being fought at this moment in time, where actually the safest thing for you would be same-sex care, and by not giving same-sex care, what you or not giving people who receive care the right to know the biological sex of the person that's caring for them, what you are doing is putting them in a more vulnerable situation in their own private space. So there are two dichotomies here, which I've tried to spell out, which demonstrate the complexity. One, why I think young people are perhaps more likely to identify as different, or believing that they are not the gender, that their gender may not meet their or sexual or attraction may not meet their biological sex, but also whilst why actually policies on the adult spectrum, kind of for everybody, may mean that we are putting vulnerable people in more vulnerable situations. It's complex.
And I think that one of the concerns that you're alluding to there is the recording of gender in place of biological sex, with gender being a subjective self-identification model of gender that has the potential to disguise someone's biological sex within that. And I know that you shared, and we were all going through prior to this, RVRP versus RB Kingston upon Thames, the case where the judge ruled that there was no obligation to record sex, as they felt gender would be a sufficient proxy for this. And I'm wondering if this might actually be a chance for you to come in, Sarah, to get, if you are prepared to do so, to talk about the sort of the legal rulings around same-sex care and how this is impacted by gender.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't know when to jump in because it's such a huge topic that I was just feeling a bit defeated, to be honest. We've managed to touch on an amazing amount. I mean, I think that this distinction between a disability that's static and will never be cured and something like anxiety, which could be more transient, it could be cured, for me is huge. When I think, every 3 years I have to prove that I haven't grown a leg back, for example. But sorry, that's just me feeling a bit overwhelmed, but trying to pin this down to a narrow topic, as you've just identified, is how are we treating this in the law? I think what's happening in the cases now about intimate same-sex care for disabled people is a really good example of how postmodernism, queer theory, gender identity is corrupting and is harmful to disabled people. There was a recent case that just came out. I don't know if you saw it. I posted it on Twitter. It's been on LinkedIn. Kingston, there's just been a determination there is no duty to provide same-sex care to disabled adults. But it's quite an odd ruling in that I can understand where it's coming from, because it says the Care Act just is meant to provide very focused, individualized care. So that tells against an operational duty that you must provide same-sex care. Although I think most people would agree when you're vulnerable and you're talking about intimate care, washing genitals, for example, most people would feel more comfortable with somebody of a similar body type to theirs. I don't link that to sexual attraction. I just mean in terms, and I think especially for women, there is that worry and that fear that a male carer does present a different risk. And I think that is statistically, sadly, undeniable. But anyway, the case said, look, 80% of carers are women. About 51% of those needing care are female. So it's almost inevitable you're going to get your female carer. I mean, what that says about disabled men who would feel embarrassed about being cared for by a woman, I don't know. But what was so shocking to me was that initially the care providers proceeded on the basis that it was actually contrary to the Equality Act to provide same-sex care. And they rode back from that, which I think helped the court decide that there wasn't a duty. They also said they were not permitted by the broader NHS principles to record sex instead of gender. So it's coming back to what you were saying about disability becoming almost something that is chosen and is subjectively defined. And while that is, I accept, very important for many people's self-actualization, we're moving further and further away from those of us with disabilities that are static, which are undeniable, and
Yes.
which need very focused care and attention. And another thing that upsets me, and I find this in my profession, the law, a lot. I get lots of emails about how do we deal with those barristers who don't feel able to disclose their disability. And I'm afraid I'm almost throwing my laptop across the room and screaming, because a lot of us don't have a choice. Our disabilities are immediately visible.
Yes.
And I really, really worry that what gender identity is doing is infecting the model of disability and the care that is given to those who are disabled by overladening it with this disability as an identity. And I'm very worried that that's an easy and a desirable thing for some people to do, because providing reasonable adjustments is really expensive. Building ramps, having equipment for those with sight or hearing issues to participate in the workplace is not as easy as handing out a lanyard or even a binder to a child. I mean, one of the most shocking cases, I think Miriam said in her caseload, she's not seeing so much children with gender identity issues. I mean, it's absolutely rocketed. I mean, still obviously in gross terms quite small, probably only about 6 children in the last 2 years, but that's compared with zero in the first 20 years of my practice. And the most shocking case that will stay with me forever is a 13-year-old girl with autism who had to be restrained in a hospital to stop her pulling out her feeding peg. And she was wearing a binder. And I'm just thinking, in terms of the needs that we have, of course we have a need for work and relationships and love, but for many disabled people, we have a need to be given just the basics that will allow us to even get on the first rung of that ladder of self-actualization. So while I'm listening to you talk about the complexities of the models of disability and the definitions, and I suppose underlining it all is my very real fear, which we've seen from the case I've just cited, is that gender identity, as one of the tentacles on this octopus of queer theory, is having a really damaging impact on disabled people. Because
Sorry, George.
Sorry, I've just, there's been so many interesting points raised, and I didn't know when to jump in, and I am feeling overwhelmed because disability is a huge tent. But for me, fundamentally, this idea that we control our own reality and our own identities does not work for those of us with observable physical disabilities. And I don't consider it part of my identity that I'm an amputee, but I need help. If it weren't for the state providing me with equipment, I wouldn't be in the workplace. I wouldn't be having friends and a social life.
Did.
And anyway, sorry, that's just descending into a
Yeah.
ramble, but I
And
hope you see my point about that the legal
yeah.
cases are putting a self-proclaimed identity above the actual needs of really vulnerable disabled people, and I'm really troubled about that.
And Sarah, I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. There are a number of things that I think you've so clearly said there. Thank you. One is that actually the disability rights movement has spent years saying my medical condition isn't relevant. The social model of disability says it's society that disables me, not my medical condition. That's rule 101 of disability of the disability rights activism. And yes, in the majority of cases, I would agree with that. What this conversation and all of our work in social work and in kind of compassionate services, what we need to say is that actually Peewe's biology is relevant. That to allude to or go back to a point that I think I indicated earlier, it is very true that being in a homosexual relationship or being same-sex attracted does not increase your likelihood of comorbidities. If you look, but if you look at those that are trans identified and that have transitioned their transition, what you see is a prevalence for a lot more comorbidities. And I quote kind of Stella O'Malley here and Jen Speck, because what you very often see is osteoporosis and other conditions that they acquire as a result of changing their or transitioning to another sex or at least trying to. And therefore, what you see, and those changes in either taking testosterone or estrogen are irreversible upon the body once they've been taken. So what you see is an irreversibility to a decision that may have been made, and I fear is being made, whilst somebody is in a temporary psychological state, which they are classing as a long-term disability.
To that, it's sort of elaborated on Sarah's concern about the sort of reality of the body in a climate where the way that we discuss disability shies away from that. You've then gone on further to say that when disability or neurodiversity meets gender has another angle to it, which is that people are becoming medical subjects, becoming disabled through the act of seeking to transition medically. And thereby there's this part of society at the moment where creating a disabled body is part of a desirable way through life, which is then in an environment where it's
that's what we are affirming.
Yeah, contentious to talk about the reality of living with a disability or the reality of the body as disabled, to the extent that I was gently told I was being too challenging in disabilities training at work because I challenged some training. In the training, I should say, I didn't challenge the delivery of it in a bigger sense. It was during the training that I challenged the way in which they would talking about the medical and social models of disability, because they were using the example of wheelchair access to a building and the provision of ramps as a positive way in which a social model stops somebody with a mobility impairment being disabled. And this kind of nuance of language is very important as a metaphor for the way in which we should respond to ADHD. And I said I didn't think that this was very useful because taken to its logical extreme, it leads to a position of almost erasure, whereby you can practically deny that somebody who needs a ramp getting into the building has anything to remark on at all, which isn't true. It's actually still going to have huge day-to-day life ramifications for that person, with or without the ramp. The ramp is helpful to get someone into a building, but it doesn't mean that in other contexts there aren't significant bodily needs. But I think that, I find this sort of taking it to its logical extreme where we can't talk about the body to the extent that we can endorse as a society people making their bodies ill. Very troubling. Obviously, in my case, with diabetes, the insulin dependency is a different kind of medical need, and without it, I certainly wouldn't have a social life at all. I wouldn't have a life to speak of. So, the idea of for me, people taking up a course of medicalization that leads to medical dependency is one that, again, going back to what does it mean for people to consent to that, which is something you discussed earlier about decision-making capacity, I think is very, very tricky. But again, in terms of how do we think about self-actualization with a vulnerable body, with a body that needs adjustment, with a body that is dependent on medical resources, on social resources, it is a very different discussion to a discussion about self-actualization or social participation in a soft power sense.
It is. Again, hopefully kind of extract and draw out, I think, something that we've all alluded to more strongly here. British people are not very good about talking about their bodies, about vulnerabilities, about things that we are squeamish about, we don't like, and therefore talking about disability in a medical sense is incredibly uncomfortable for society in general because we're squeamish. It means disclosing personal information, and it means actually admitting our own human fragility, because we all have a risk that one day we might be disabled. And sadly, we live in a society where adjustments are so slow for people with disabilities that you are probably you'll probably only realise what disability means when you become disabled yourself. So it's much easier and much more fashionable, much more radical to talk about the dismantling of policies, of how society is not designed in the right way. It's much more progressive to talk about the social model of disability in that sense. It's much more fashionable. Indeed, I believe, although I'm not an expert in this, it's actually quite a revolutionary Marxist idea in its connotations, which means that it's much more progressive to do so. Now, if you look at where, as far as I understand it, gender affirming ideology first came from or arguably first came from it. It came from the more progressive kind of European countries, the Netherlands, Germany, etc. And therefore, and it became a progressive, revolutionary idea and that we could claim our identity, and that we could kind of admit that society that was in some way not working for us, and reclaim that, take pride in that. And the same is true if you look at the countries that have legalized assisted suicide. Germany, the Netherlands, all of these countries are the countries that have done it first. I genuinely contest here. We are the radical ones on this podcast, because we're actually saying society isn't working for those that need the most support. And we need to admit biology, we need to admit that people are more vulnerable than others, and we need to actually build in conversations that enable people with disabilities to live the lives in the relationships that they want to. And at this moment in time, we do not live in a society that does those things, but somehow it is becoming easier for people to claim an identity, to claim a label, and claim a community. And we are facilitating the long-term harm that may and does bring, because we recognize the short-term joy that it might bring people who are traumatized to have found a fashionable community.
So, guys, thank you for that, George. We've crossed over the hour mark and gone a bit over our time. I just want to sort of say a few words quickly to summarize some of what I'm understanding from that, because our first portion of this conversation, we focused a lot on actually the crossover between gender identity and disability. And I'm glad that we managed to get to this point where we're talking about the divergence in terms of their experiences, because what we're effectively talking about is in disability, where you've historically had a medical model of responding to it, and there's been advocacy for a social approach to that and a social understanding of that, although it has its limitations, as Miriam sort of pointed out. With gender identity, what we seem to have is a social phenomenon that's being made into a medical one through making children, anyone who goes on to cross-sex hormones is going to have to take them for life, or the effects of those will be reversed, or will start to reverse. They won't completely reverse. I don't want to misrepresent that. And so, but at the same time, I think, Miriam, you pointed out something very interesting when you were talking about the ramps and wheelchairs example, where the social model of disability was offering perhaps a idealistic view that doesn't capture the whole picture, that actually may be offering as somewhat of a false promise, where it's saying, if we change society, your disability will be completely gone, which isn't the case. Whereas on the other hand, with gender identity, it's the medical side that we've got offering the false promise of resolution. And so I just thought that was a very interesting similarity between the two of them. So it's a shame we've run out of time, because I have so much more that I would love for us to cover. I don't feel like we really did justice to the safeguarding concerns, or the care. I feel like we could have gone much deeper into that. So perhaps it's something that we'll have to do again in the future if everyone is up for it. Does anyone have any final words that they'd like to say before we wrap it up?
This is the first conversation I've heard on this topic.
I think that says a lot. I think it does speak to the general complexity of disability, but also what George touched on, the reluctance to speak about the reality of the body and hard things. And that is the safeguarding issue, isn't it? We're telling children they can be something they can never be. And that is simply cruel. It's, if someone had told me, don't worry, Sarah, your leg will grow. I remember being very upset as a small child, and nobody knew what to say to me. And I don't think it would be any better now, would it? Because we still can't have these difficult conversations.
And and what is also a question that we can't answer now, but I would genuinely like to ask, is that do adults, non-disabled adults, parents, were they supported to process the harm of bullying? Like so that in all of these circumstances, professionals, families, there is somebody affirming the idea that these young people, these disabled people, are other than the biological sex that they were born, and part of that narrative is often that is often that the adults themselves have a lived experience of 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 harm being done to them, or and and therefore within these organizations, businesses, etc., through EDI, what a lot of professional adults, I believe, find is a space where they can undo what they see to be the harm that was once done to them. And that needs to be unpacked because because um, because in this circumstance we can't allow the cycle of the bullied becoming the bully, or the traumatized becoming the traumatizer, and that needs to be unpacked especially when people with disabilities won't necessarily have the voice or the resource to speak up against that narrative.
It seems like we'll have to get you back in the future then, George. All right, we'll leave it there then. Thank you, everyone.